before we sort of proceed with the session, I would just like to, introduce all of our panelists today. So in no particular order, we have Horatio Georgestone, the founder of the Young Diverse World Changers. And the Young Diverse World Changers, or YDWC, is a professional network designed and run by and dedicated to young professionals from BAME backgrounds. And YDWC challenges it understands the unique challenges faced by underrepresented people in competitive professions, and aims to actually empower them and equip them with the tools, knowledge, and connections to overcome structural barriers. And in terms of Horatio, part of his work is to facilitate a positive global change and to inspire. And his career has spanned from financial PR to civil service. And so he actually has a good understanding of the challenges facing BAME staff in Parliament and civil service. And also, he has worked with Parliament senior leadership last year on organisations' response to Black Lives Matter. So if we could have a virtual clap for Horatio. I know this is a bit different. If possible, if we could have a clap for Horatio. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, and we also have Rosalind Goates from the Social Mobility Foundation. So Rosalind Goates is the head of Advocacy and Campaigns at the Social Mobility Foundation and Department of Opportunities. And just a bit on the Social Mobility Foundation. Social Mobility Foundation was founded in 2005 in order to provide opportunities and support for 16 to 17-year-olds who are unable to get that support from schools or families, and basically to help them to facilitate increased social mobility. The Social Mobility Foundation has, experienced a lot of success in helping those individuals actually get into university and into the professional world. Rosalind joined the Social Mobility Foundation in September 2020 from Portland Communications, where she was senior consultant. And also before Portland, Rosalind was the public affairs manager at the ACCA, and she led the organization's advocacy work on social mobility. And alongside her current role, she's also the chair of Brunel's University's Business School Advisory Board. So again, if we could have a clap for Rosalind from the Social Mobility Foundation. Again, it's a pleasure to have you here. Yeah. So, and we also have Dr. Abigail McKnight, the director of the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion at LSE. Yeah, so Abigail has been working at LSE since 1999, and Abigail's research interests include social mobility, especially downward mobility, multidimensional inequality, low-wage employment, labour inequality, and the list goes on. A variety of different research interests. And Abigail actually organises case welfare policy and analysis seminars, and is an editorial board member of Social Inclusion. And she's also recently held research grants from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Nuffield Foundation, and many more. So again, if we could have a round of applause for our third guest, Dr. Abigail McKnight. Again, we really appreciate having you here. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Right, so now I'm going to hand over to Juliana, Musa, and Sarah Elquad for the moderators of today's session. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Ayo. So the first question, which we'll direct to Abigail, so she's researched social mobility quite extensively, is have you found that race and social mobility have links to each other in your work? And if so, what are they?
Yes, hi. I have found that there is a link between ethnicity and social mobility. Perhaps I'll say a little bit about what I've worked on and the evidence that I've looked at. So I did a review for the Social Mobility Commission, looking at evidence, UK evidence mainly, on the relationship between ethnicity and social mobility, and I could get onto some of the findings that we came up with in that review. And then separately, I've done an empirical study with Lindsay McMillan at the Institute of Education at UCL, and we analysed labour force survey data and estimated differences between ethnic minority groups and looking at intersections with education as well as gender to understand what the differences are. And they show some quite interesting differences between groups. And I think the results overall, both from the review and from the empirical work that I've done, caution us against grouping ethnic minorities into one category, because there are quite clear differences between groups in terms of social mobility prospects, although there might be some shared aspects of factors that might limit social mobility more broadly.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Please do add questions to the chat to the public, and we'll ask them as we go along as well. My second question is for you, Horatio, about the experience of social mobility and the intersections with race, both personally and in the work that you do.
Thank you so much. And may I begin by saying it's a really big pleasure to be here with you at ParliON, and I hope that everyone's having a good afternoon so far. So just to bounce off the ideas that have been given to us by Dr. Abigail, I think it's absolutely right to highlight that there are often overlaps between both of these fields, both social class and race, but they are very, very distinct. And there are a few things that I would pull out. And I highlight here that I don't come to this as an expert. I come simply as an individual who is sharing their own experience. So if I was to kind of break down some of the experience of race versus some of the experience of my social background, I think that I'm going to be able to highlight one or two things, but I do this in the context that I think that inclusion is about recognizing, understanding, and welcoming difference in a world where it's really easy to just group things because it makes it more convenient for us to deal with them. And so to that extent, when I'm thinking about my race and my experience as a person who is a Black man of African descent here in the UK, I think about the fact of profiling and how people are stopped and searched, how it is that you can see someone and think that because of the way that they look, actually there are ramifications there. I think about our job system and the fact that actually from a CV context, if you have a certain name, that has implications for your progression. I think about culture and language, the fact that we can take for granted that actually people engage in different ways and actually there are different understandings. Some of the most important things that I've been able to personally learn how to do is to make jokes, and that comes from a recognition of cultural standpoints and insights that people have in different spaces. Other things that are really important from a racial standpoint that have stood out to me are role models. Now, it's really interesting to note that in many spaces there is an underrepresentation of people, but in many instances, as a Black man looking at senior leadership teams, often I see that there is no other person there. And actually, just in being able to kind of see some of those people that you could move and aspire to is really, really obviously important for some people. And I contextualize that against some of the actual things that come out in the context of being a person from a working class background, as I am. There are things like the impacts that that's had on my educational experience, where, and again, there is no ubiquitous, everyone has the same experience, but in my instance, growing up in East London, I've had friends who have been stabbed and killed. I've had friends who have come up with influences that have been pushed on them because actually the environments that they're in, whether you think about parental situations, whether you think about the wider environment and the challenges that you have within the context of some of the areas that I've grown up in, actually all of those have a significant influence, as well as the fact that actually often there's a real piece around being able to kind of be exposed to different ideas, influences, and areas. There's a work that was done recently by the British Council that showed that the reason why they felt that international travel was important was because of the way in which it helped to open and expand people's ideas. And actually, there is something there about often when you are in communities where you're not really able to kind of travel to explore or to kind of gain wider insights, that again has a kind of limiting impact overall. And because I don't want to utilize all of my time, or all of the time more generally, the final thing I would say is this. There are definitely overlaps between the two, and there are definitely real reasons to understand both of these as being important things that we need to work through and support people with. But having said that, it's important to recognize that there are distinctions, and I hope that I've been able to lay out some of those just from my own personal perspective.
Would Abigail or Rosalind like to come in on anything Horatio's just said?
Well, I mean, just to say that the lived experience is so valuable for understanding this kind of intersection of race, of gender, of class. And Horatio, I think, really highlighted some of the difficulties that you can encounter from that intersectional position and the influences that are around you. And when we do the empirical work, we just look at averages. And I mean, I started saying, oh, we should look at smaller groups, but from an individual perspective, you can really look at that lived experience. And perhaps I'll just highlight some of the findings we get from the empirical research as a sort of bit of context for people. We do find overall that ethnic minorities are more likely to be downwardly mobile, less likely to be upwardly mobile. First generation migrants are particularly likely to be downwardly mobile, so they have difficulties in securing positions that reward the skills and qualifications that they have and that they bring with them. Second generation can look like they're more successful overall, but some of that is a kind of bounce back. Second generation have been educated in the UK, understand the culture, understand how the system works, and find it easier to gain jobs to match with their skills, although we do know that ethnic minorities are overeducated when we look at their position in the labour market. There is evidence of occupational segregation. There are much higher rates of unemployment and inactivity. But when we get down to the finer details and we look at the groups that are most disadvantaged or have the greatest challenges in terms of opportunities for upward mobility, say, we know that Black Caribbean men, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Black African men and women are all particularly some of the greatest barriers to upward mobility. While on the other hand, Chinese and Indian men and women, particularly men, are much more likely to be upwardly mobile and less likely to be downwardly mobile. So some of the background statistics.
Thank you. I just wanted to read a comment in the chat. This is actually a comment about what you just said, Horatio. It's from Chavayo. Superb point on the differences between people of colour and importance of being specific about how racial inequality affects us all. This is why Bain bracket does not work. Great point, Horatio, on representative leadership, being able to see leaders that look like us. Within the civil service, we have a long way to go in making sure our senior leadership is representative of our communities. There's no shortage of talent, skills, and potential within people of colour. You're free to respond, otherwise I can move on to the next question.
So very, very simply, I would say absolutely. Again, coming back to the point that we made about inclusion, it really is about accepting difference, being ready to understand that we're going to have to be nuanced in how it is that we help people to feel welcome and feel included within the context of the working environment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail and Horatio. Rosalind, you're head of Advocacy and Campaigns at the Social Mobility Foundation. What sort of barriers does the foundation look at?
So firstly, again, just to say thank you so much for having me here today to join the panel. So there's sort of three things that the Social Mobility Foundation does. So we have a programme where we work with young people to get into the top universities and top professions. We then have our Social Mobility Employer Index. So we're looking at the barriers to employment, working with employers to advocate for change, to ensure they're more inclusive. And then the Department for Opportunities, which is our sort of newest strand, which we're probably a bit less known for, which is looking at systemic change. So where the programme works with high academic achievers, the Department for Opportunities is looking at problems that, you know, affect all young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So digital poverty, the exams crisis last summer, and unfortunately the looming exam situation this summer. And just to kind of echo what's been said by the panel, our core purpose is about increasing inclusion and removing barriers for young people so they can achieve their potential. And I think it is really important to note that there is an intersectionality point around lower economic background and race, but they are distinct problems in their own right, and they should be treated as such. And that's kind of the view of our organisation.
Do you think there are any key measurements that the panel have found to support the case for a diverse workforce? That's for Rosalind.
Oh, sorry. I thought, because you said to the panel, I wasn't sure if you meant specifically me. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm not quite clear what you're asking.
It was, are there any key measurements that you find to support the case for a diverse workforce?
I mean, there is so much data and evidence that points to kind of why it's important to have an inclusive and diverse workforce. I think what we measure and look at through our index is how that you can be sure that an organisation is doing that, and what the practical steps are that organisations can take to make sure that they're building a recruitment pipeline that is inclusive, to make sure that they're actually assessing their organisation. One of the things that always surprises me is that there is a class pay gap. So not only is there a barrier to entering an organisation, multiple barriers, but also once you're in the organisation, there's a real challenge around progression and the likelihood of progression. And then that is reflected as well, unfortunately, in your pay, which sort of sits at, I think, 7% is the class pay gap at the moment.
Horatio, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, just really quickly. So the question around measurements for the benefit of diversity is a really fascinating one, because often we are really quick to kind of look at value from the standpoint of if we can measure something, then maybe we can treasure it. And so people have come up with reports. McKinsey have done a lot of work on diversity and inclusion. Matthew Said has brought out a book called Rebel Ideas, really looking at diversity and inclusion. And what they've found from it is that there is a business case based on risk minimization, generation of innovation, being able to really challenge systems and processes to move forward. But what I would like to highlight is beyond the business case, even if there wasn't a business case for diversity and inclusion, there is an ethical case. There's a strong recognition that we as people matter. And if we think that people matter, yes, we are going to pay attention to the business case, but there is strong enough ground just to make sure that people feel accepted and welcome within their environment and feel free to do the best that they can within the working context that they're operating in.
Sarah, would you like to come in and ask a question?
We've actually had a question from Sopal in the chat. I will ask Abigail about this, but other people, please feel free to come in. Can you tell us more about cultural capital and how this impacts ethnic people from a low socioeconomic background?
That's a difficult question. I mean, you can see, even from the discussion we've had so far, how cultural capital can be important in terms of fitting into the society where the structures are in place that's set in terms of recruitment, retention, promotion. Those types of cultural aspects can be really important. I'm not a cultural capital expert, I'd say that, but it is clearly the case that there are aspects of this relationship between social mobility and racial inequalities and cultural capital. And I'd say some of it, and I include myself in this, is ignorance on the part of us, not understanding those aspects of cultural capital and what could be done to embrace that much more and celebrate it.
Yeah, I just the one thing I'd add to that, I'd urge everyone in attendance to read The Class Pay Gap, which talks quite a lot about the importance of cultural cachet, cultural capital, the implications of that for your progression in the workplace. And it can be assessed, it can be looked at. Like, there are employers who we work with who are looking to kind of unpick the bias, the culture, the implications of that for progression in the workplace. So it is a big concern, but there are, the point is that you can look at it, you can address it, business can and should be making those changes.
I'd say very, very quickly that there is a common question of whether or not the classroom is preparing people for the boardroom, whether or not our focus from an educational standpoint is enough about the social skills that people are picking up in order to navigate the environments that they're in. And in that regard, I see social capital or cultural capital as incredibly important, being able to understand the systems and the people that you are operating with in order to facilitate your growth or progression within those systems. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time now, but people place emphasis on the 3 R's, and the fact that actually from a revenue, reputational or relationships standpoint, it's important for people to be able to understand what they can do in order to make progress, i.e. from a revenue standpoint, how can you as a person who may be a cultural outsider in a space build your skill base in order to be valuable and to continue to leverage spaces? How can you build your reputation, your understanding, your brand, particularly recognizing that you might have to understand the systems that you are trying to integrate into, and that in itself might have a challenge. Finally, how is it that you build relationships? How is it that you build networks of people who help to support and take you forward in your career? Again, all of these things are challenges which are not going to magically disappear if there is an intervention or support in order to help people to navigate those challenges.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to read another one from the chat. We've had so many amazing questions and comments. I'd really want to read them all, and we'll save some for the end. So thank you everyone that's been inputting. I'm going to ask Abigail this question, but again, please do input. Does the I'll read the whole comment. There's a growing Black middle class within the UK. However, the experience of Black middle class people are rarely discussed within the wider discussions of race and social mobility. Does the research conducted by the panel, and Abigail, I don't know if you've done any research on this, highlight any differences in experience, for example, in terms of social mobility between Black people from different socioeconomic groups?
Yes, you do. I mean, it's when you're measuring social mobility, we're interested in what people's origin position is and what their destination, in sort of technical terms, what was their class of origin and what was their class they achieved, or what was their income, their parental income, and what income they achieved. So we might use different metrics for measuring social mobility. So understanding where people are within that origin distribution is really important for understanding their chances of upward or downward mobility. Now, I mean, I hesitate a little bit for grouping Black together, because a Black Caribbean and Black African are very different. And we know, partly because of the migration patterns, a lot of Black Caribbeans came to the UK in the 1950s after the Second World War, while Black Africans are newer migrants. We have more first-generation migrants among Black Africans. And even the pattern of migration amongst Black Africans is very different depending on which part of Africa you come from and when you came. So some Black Africans are coming for work-related reasons, and there's some sort of positive selection. So they already come in actually with quite well-educated backgrounds and income, while others are fleeing to the UK because of war and violence in their home countries. And those are very different situations in which to arrive, and that you need to understand when you're looking at social mobility. And so we do like to look at first generation versus second generation and understanding some of these differences. And so yes, there is definitely the case that there is a growing Black middle class, who are being successful. So when I talk about some of these statistics, we're talking about averages, and that's hides a lot of what's happening beneath the surface. Is that they're not. It's not the case that all ethnic minorities limit opportunities for upward mobility and all experience downward mobility. It's not the case at all. There's a lot of churn, there's a lot of opportunities within that. And certainly it's the case that there is becoming an established middle class, not just amongst Black Africans, but amongst Indian and Chinese as well, who are positioning themselves much further up distribution and have been incredibly successful in terms of gaining education and higher education as well.
Abigail, you made some really good points about downward social mobility. I was wondering what that looks like, and that's not something we often talk about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I've done research on downward mobility and the lack of downward mobility for children from very privileged, rich family backgrounds, and how in a very unequal society like the UK, where families have very unequal levels of resources that they can use to invest in their children, say in terms of getting them into the good schools or sending them to a private school, getting them to all the clubs, doing all the things they can to make sure that their children aren't downwardly mobile. Those children then effectively block opportunities for upward mobility for high ability children from less advantaged family backgrounds. So if you can imagine, when there are fewer opportunities, and particularly we're likely to face this when the economy goes into recession, there are fewer opportunities in the labour market. The middle classes, the wealthy families are very good at hanging on to those opportunities, getting their children into the right place. They're doing the right thing by their children. It's not a criticism of what they're doing. But what happens if the systems and structures are in place that allow them to, what we call opportunity hoard, they hoard all of those best opportunities in the education system and in the labour market, they then really limit the chances of upward mobility for children of high ability who work hard, who doing all of the right things. So it is an issue that's not talked about very much because of it's not very popular to suggest that we need to increase downward mobility in order to increase upward mobility. And politicians like to concentrate on what we call absolute social mobility, this idea that you can be better off in real terms than your parents were.
I'd ask this to Abigail and indeed the whole panel. Have you seen this amplified during COVID?
Well, I think we probably haven't seen the full effects of it yet, but I'm sure in the next few years we are really going to see that. Because some families have got richer during COVID, and richer families have tended to get richer, while those at the bottom of the distribution have struggled and have accumulated debts and so on. So that creates even greater inequality. And when there are fewer opportunities in the labour market, then parents will continue to do what's right for their children, which is to try and hang on to those best opportunities. If they're competing for places at the best universities or in the labour market or in the best schools, they hoard those opportunities, and that means that overall the UK is less socially mobile than it would be.
Thanks, Abigail. I'll come to Rosalind now. Can you tell us a bit about what schemes the social movement is working on at the moment?
So yeah, I think the scheme probably most pertinent to this group is that we're working with the Houses of Parliament on a restoration project. So we started in May. We've got 20 internship places for our students and some work experience as well. The kind of core program that the Social Mobility Foundation runs is across 11 industries. So we work with a range of employers across accountancy, architecture, finance, and then the kind of other more campaigning elements and bits that we're working on at the moment primarily focus around digital poverty. So we saw during the past year that there were kids who didn't have access to a laptop for the majority of the lockdown. Obviously, there's huge implications on that for social mobility within the kind of the next decade. And we're also doing a lot around exams this summer, as I mentioned earlier today. So that's kind of what we're focused on at the moment. And it will be interesting to see, we run our annual employer index every year, so we'll be launching the key findings in October time, and it will be interesting to see kind of what the response of employers has been during the pandemic, the consequences for that, areas that will need to change, advice that we'll need to offer employers to ensure that we don't move backwards on the progress we've made in the last decade.
And has COVID affected the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like any other organisation, we had to turn a sort of face-to-face programme digital overnight. And I'm sure most people in the room face similar challenges. I'm pleased to say that we managed to do it. So we continue to work with a cohort of 2,000 young people during the pandemic. We shifted the focus of our campaigns to make sure that we were looking at the practical intervention. So I mentioned laptops. We ran a campaign to get devices to both our students and young people across the country to try and mitigate some of the impacts of COVID. So yeah, we managed to get through it, and we're continuing to work with young people. And as a result of going digital, we've reached more people than ever. So there has been some silver linings to the dark cloud.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. So Horatio, I was very interested in your experience in the civil service and working in Parliament. So from that experience, what can we learn and what can we do better?
So there are a few things that I would highlight, but just before then, I wanted to quickly touch on something that was raised in one of the comments, and someone had basically suggested, what can we learn from the recent race report, and do we think it's been helpful or unhelpful? Now, I know I don't want to kind of take us down a rabbit hole of speaking specifically just about the report. I know that it has been an incredibly charged report which has brought lots of response from people just because of the way in which it was structured and some of the suggestions that it has come out with. The thing that I would highlight as a general response is that diversity presents us with a really interesting paradox, in the sense that we continue to suggest that diversity is beautiful and brilliant. It provides us with so many advantages in terms of innovation, different insights, as well as just incredible people. But at the same time, we often say that people from diverse backgrounds are disadvantaged. And that's not because they don't have ability. That's not because they don't have potential. It's because of the structures that they're in. And so there's this real tension around what you can do to ensure that the systems change enough to ensure that every person from every background can meet their potential. And I think that question of how much change we need to infuse into our systems is a really live one. And until we really resolve that, we are still going to continue to have those conversations about whether or not these reports are helping or hindering. But I think it is useful to tease out that there are areas where we are making progress. There are areas where significant progress is we still need to make, and we should never ever confuse any small steps forward as us completely coming to a situation where everything has been resolved. And in that space, thinking about moving forward, thinking about my experience within the civil service, I will highlight some of the things that have really helped to kind of really bring in inclusion. The first thing I would highlight is fostering what I, in small senses, call a culture of curiosity. That is to say that in any organization, there is usually an implicit bias towards keeping things the way that they are, maintaining the same ideas, doing things in the way that they've been done because we're comfortable with it, because we don't really seek to do things in a different way. And that means as managers, as leaders within a team, there's a real impetus on us to really think about the ways in which we can challenge and also encourage people to come with different ideas. That's not just about race or social mobility, more generally creating spaces where people feel that they can challenge, can express, can be themselves, and can bring a new insight into work. The second area that I think is really important, and I apologize because people often say to me in the space of diversity and inclusion, there are so many different words to learn, and I'm not really sure what all of them mean. And I'm going to give you 4 words right now, and probably some people will still leave the call thinking, I don't like all of these words. But generally speaking, people highlight the importance of mentoring, of sponsorship, of coaching, and of allyship. And so in the mentoring space, we're speaking about the cultural and social support that you can provide to a person that helps them to feel comfortable and welcome within an organization, and you take responsibility for doing that for a person or group of people as a direct responsibility. In the sponsorship space, we think specifically about the career progression of individuals within the workplace, and you taking responsibility for helping someone in a kind of lower grade or position than you to kind of move forward by sharing them with them specific insights, support, and help. In the space of coaching, we're speaking about not just actually advocating for people, as we did in the space of sponsorship, but actually going to help people to make sure that they've got the training, insights, and the availability of resources to them to actually improve in a way that is going to help them to move their career forward. And finally, in the allyship space, that means even if I have zero responsibility to another individual, I make sure that as far as I can be, I'm advocating for an open, inclusive environment that questions, that challenges, and allows for new ideas. And so, having said all of that, I'm going to pause very quickly because, again, I've gone on some form of monologue. But all I would say is this, that it's important to set meaningful targets. It's important not to be scared to have challenging conversations. And again, within the context of YDWC, that's what we continue to champion. And I pause there for reflections from the wider panel.
Thank you so much for those really clear ideas that, you know, I'm sure many people would like to take forward. I don't know whether Abigail or Rosalind want to come in on anything that Horatio said or any thoughts and ideas that you might have too.
I mean, I'd agree with everything that you've just said and echo that. I always think when we work with young people on the programme, the bit they're always not that interested in when they start is the mentoring. They're like, why is this slightly old, weird person offering to help me? What are they going to bring? They don't know anything about me. And it is the bit that they always leave saying was the most impactful. And the amount of kids that I've met that continue to stay in touch with their mentor for, like, you know, years and years into their career it's so important, because it's that guidance, that different perspective, and that support that you need to kind of give you the confidence to move on and up in your career.
Thanks, Rosalind. We have a question that's relevant to what you've been saying and what Horatio was saying earlier. And it's from Previn. He says, I have established a mentoring scheme for BAME staff in the department I work in, but it appears that mentoring only goes so far for much of the reasons that have already been discussed. So I was wondering whether a move from mentoring to active sponsorship would better support BAME staff and improve diversity in the department. If so, how could this be achieved?
So again, I'm very cautious. I've said so much already, but I'll keep it really short in saying that we've had a few questions. One in terms of what some of the differences are. So, for example, someone has asked, what's the difference between mentoring and allyship, for example? Being an ally is being an advocate for change in the wider sense. A mentor has a specific responsibility to an individual to help and support their career progression. A sponsor is someone who is going to actually help behind the scenes. So where, for example, you can advocate in performance situations, you can advocate in a kind of interview context. A sponsor is helping you through those processes. An ally might be making bigger changes like reverse mentoring, changes to the recruitment system, changes to the culture, as well as obviously a coach being a direct person who is giving you insights, and that might be a manager or so on. Again, in the context of this quick call, I'm not going to be able to detail everything, but the long and short is there are, as has been alluded to in the question that was posed, the point is that there are different types of support which are important for people. There is an aspect of helping the individual to grow. There is an aspect of changing the organization. There is an aspect of making sure that other mechanisms are put in place, which is why we have these different words, which I know kind of sound the same, but really do have distinct purposes to play.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, happy to kind of pick up and have a separate conversation offline if you want to talk about the sort of specifics of why you think it's not quite working or how it could be improved. So I'm sure details would be shared on the panel, but I think my email address is probably on the internet on our website. So happy to have a conversation about that offline and offer some advice.
Sarah, would you like to come in and ask a question?
Yeah. So you've got a question here from Joseph. What are the panel's views concerning how geographical issues affect social mobility? I have found the majority of civil service opportunities are in London. I don't know whether, Abigail, you want to comment on this, but really open to the whole panel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually moving to London and being in London improves your chances of upward social mobility. It's a good place to be for social mobility because the good opportunities are there. We tend to have a sort of very geographical spread across the UK in terms of where different ethnic minorities live, with large concentrations in the Midlands and in London and up in the north west in particular, and so it sometimes can be a bit difficult to untangle what's geography from the other influences that might be in terms of living in big cities or the area in which you live in, or if you live in an area which is in economic decline and has been for some time. Really the best way for upward mobility is to move to London or a bigger city.
What do you think can be done to change this? And I direct this to everyone.
So I'm still on mute. A year into the pandemic, and I still find myself talking on mute. So yeah, there is a massive problem. It was a couple of years ago, the Social Mobility Commission identified and has termed what it calls social mobility cold spots. So areas in the country which particularly have low levels of social mobility. And one of the things that we do as an organisation is actively advocate for businesses to have support and opportunities for people from those areas specifically. So making sure that their school outreach programs target those areas of the country, and encouraging them to offer opportunities that can be done remotely, particularly in the pandemic, so that people don't feel they do have to leave their community to have that opportunity. And I think actually one of the things that's come out from the levelling up agenda and the Queen's speech and some of the legislation that's come through is how can we create opportunities that mean people don't have to leave. And actually it shouldn't be the case that we say to people, well, to get a good job, to get the career that you're looking for, you're going to have to move elsewhere. And I think we're encouraged by the government's noises that it wants to do more to make sure that actually there's opportunity in all parts of the UK. And we will, as an organisation, continue to push businesses to focus on that.
Definitely, thank you. And just to say thank you to all the comments in the chat. It's really great. They're all loving all of your comments, so thank you so much. I've got a question here. It's kind of a global question, I guess, so I'm just going to put it out and hope that someone will come back with a comment. I'd love to hear all your opinions. How do we compare in the UK on the race, social mobility versus other similar countries, so perhaps the G7 and G20?
Perhaps I'll come in and say, in terms of academic research, it's an area where there are real knowledge gaps. So we know quite a bit about race and social mobility in the US. There's good published evidence on that, and it's difficult to make that straight comparison between the two. America is more unequal than we are, and that makes it much more difficult to have higher levels of social mobility. And there's much greater segregation in terms of occupations and opportunities in the US. So I think if you could find a metric that could allow you to make that comparison, you would find it was the case. So we know if we compare just in terms of social mobility, that the UK and the US are up there as low social mobility countries and high inequality countries, but the US tends to be just a bit further down the order. So I mean, it's always a concern that the whole idea of the American dream is not really a reality for most people. in the US, but it does mention to sustain a system that allows for very discrimination and segregation.
So I don't want to go into detail around research, because I know my learned colleagues on the panel will be able to provide that piece. All I would say is that anecdotally, from conversations that I've had with many people, there's a suggestion that by comparison, obviously we have different histories compared to many other countries, and that has meant that we have developed our systems in different ways. And the thing that consistently comes out from conversations is that the UK often does things in a kind of subtle way. When you experience or are speaking about discrimination, it's not always going to be something that makes the headline, which is going to be a really big thing that's in your face. Often it's the subtleties, it's the ways in which someone will speak to you, the way in which, you know, actually, if it was another person, things would have happened in a different way, which makes it difficult sometimes to make the comparisons, because when you make the comparison, you think a really big, wild situation versus something which hasn't grabbed as much of a attention. And so I'd say, whilst it is really important to think about some of those differences and to recognize the ways in which actually some of those themes are kind of played out in the media, it's also important to reflect in the kind of almost subtle nature, if you will, of some of the experiences that people will have here, which are no less relevant, no less significant, but absolutely, in many instances, can be even more difficult to root out because they're so ingrained and because often receive so little attention.
Sorry, I'm also stuck on mute as usual. Thank you so much, Horatio. I kind of think there's a last question here about other intersections with social mobility, and I think it might be quite nice to end on this question. So I don't know whether every panelist wants to come in, but the question asks if there's evidence that age and disability are also affected by mobility issues. But I'd like to add to that if there's any other intersections, whether that's gender, sexuality as well. Yeah, as a last point.
To be honest, I'm not an expert in that space. I think, yeah, we know gender is an issue, we know race is an issue, we know class is. I wouldn't sort of want to comment on the other areas, but I think, yeah, it's a sort of fair assumption to say that they do intersect, and that has certain implications for social mobility, but not much to say, I'm afraid, on the sort of specifics of that.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't think it's been quantified very well, but we do know about intersections between gender and class, and gender and race. Disability, I think there's been much less research in terms of looking at social mobility, and it would be interesting to know more. I mean, we know all sorts of other things that in terms of disadvantage and so on. It's a difficult one to unpick a little bit because you tend to get onset of disability later in life, and you need to unpick the differences between age and so on. But it would be an interesting area to look at. But any of these areas really where there is disadvantage and there are barriers to succeeding in the labour market, you will have social mobility barriers. It's a case in general.
So all I would say is, again, I can't comment on statistics. I leave that to my learned friends to be able to kind of share those. But I would flag, as we highlighted right at the beginning, that inclusion is really about accepting and welcoming difference. And to that extent, intersectionality plays on that idea that we have multiple things that make us different, multiple things that make us incredible and special in whichever way that we might be. And I think it's important to recognize that in all of the conversations that we have around diversity and inclusion, sometimes visibly we see difference and we can understand or see that someone is different for a specific reason. I'm a man, I'm a black man. In many instances, you don't see those differences. You don't know that I'm dyslexic. You don't know that I have other pieces that actually might be impacting my ability to progress myself, to be happy, and to live in the communities that we live in. So all of that is to say that, generally speaking, there is so much that we need to do to address these intersectionalities, so much that needs to be done to really think about the differences that we can make to the ways in which we support and help others within our wider society. And in many ways, all of us need to take responsibility for being allies to each other. I think the final thing that I would end with is that I see so often that people change D&I into almost a competition between different segments. Why is it that people from diverse backgrounds might say, sorry, why is it that people from cultural backgrounds get this? Why is it that people from certain sexual backgrounds get this? Why is it that people from certain health backgrounds get this? It is so important that all people who face any kind of challenge in whichever space it might be are able to come together to recognize that, yes, there are distinctions and differences in their experiences, but there is a joint need to come together in order to bring about the actions that transform our workplace. And unless we're able to do that, splintering is never really going to help. And really, the future is in our hands to continue to make the progress that will help us to bring about the society that we would all like to live in and the workplaces that we would like to thrive in.
Can I just say one thing before we wrap? Completely agree with everything you said. I just want to say to the audience, there is 3 things that you can do following this discussion that can make social mobility in the UK better. So firstly, if you have got an old laptop, please go to endlaptoppoverty.org. You can donate it. A kid with a laptop is still twice as likely to get better A levels even before the pandemic. So kids still need laptops, even though they're back in the classroom. You can sign up to be a mentor with the Social Mobility Foundation. And if you're not, I would urge you to. It's a really rewarding experience. And finally, for those civil servants on the call, if your department has not entered the Social Mobility Employer Index, ask why, please, and make sure that they are entering, if not this year, then next.
We have a final point following on from what Rosalind just said. What does Abigail recommend and what does Horatio recommend?
In terms of overall improving social mobility, I'm actually a really big fan of the Social Mobility Foundation's Employer Index. I think it's a great policy. It's a voluntary policy that employers take on, and it really allows them to understand their recruitment, their promotion, all the systems that they have in place and structures they have in place, and fully engage in that process to think about how they can improve things in the workplace. I'm a big fan. I don't think Rosalind knows. I'm a big fan of their index. I think there's a lot you can do there. In terms of overall, what can we do to improve social mobility in the UK? And I'd say broadly, not just looking at ethnic differences, reduce inequality, eradicate child poverty would be my 2 main things on my wish list.
3 very quick things. Number 1, embrace a culture of curiosity. Number 2, as we say, think about whether or not you can become a mentor, sponsor, coach, ally, or any of the other really interesting insights that we've seen in the chat. Finally, visit ydwc.org and figure out if you would like to come to a future event, conversation, or encourage your organization to partner with us to discuss some of these challenges moving forward. But the final thing I would say is you've been an actually incredible audience. I look forward to, after this chat, going through all of the messages that you've sent and being able to follow some of the threads. Thank you again.
Horatio, and we've actually got time for one more question, but before that I'll read a comment from Maxine, who is our D&I head, acting D&I head at the moment. She says an amplifier ensures that a range of voices can be heard. It focuses on representation and communication. In a workplace, this can be ensuring that your voice can be heard in meetings and supporting your contribution vocally. So thanks, Maxine. And then final question, we'll bring it a bit closer to home and note that there seems to be a bit of momentum around this issue, thinking particularly about the response to Black Lives Matter last year in Parliament and across the civil service. Horatio, have you seen any change following on from Black Lives Matter last year, or did the focus on race stop there?
So I've seen some substantive conversations, and I think that given that awareness of a problem is the first step towards being able to challenge it, that has been a really important move forward. I'm seeing many organizations who are engaging with the idea of needing to do something to help employees progress in their careers. I'm seeing them think more about the way that they recruit. I'm seeing people think about how it is that they hold conversations like this. And let's talk about race in whichever form it might be, has now been something that many institutions have done, recognizing the real need to actually come to grips with this. Having said that, all of that, everything that we have done within the last year is just the beginning of a conversation, is just the beginning of a process. And I think any organization, irrespective of how much progress they may have made over the last 12 months, has so much more to do. And we can only hope that all of us play the best role that we can in continuing to drive that change.
So Juliana, are we taking any more questions?
No, I think it's over to you, Aya.
All right. So again, thanks for everyone for turning up. Thank you, Horatio, Rosalind, Abigail. Thank you to all the moderators at ParliON, and thank you for all who have come from the civil service, Parliament, and other organisations. We're really, really grateful for having you here today. So I think that's pretty much it. Have a good rest of your day, everyone, and good weekend as well. All right.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.